This series of videos will explore some of the most iconic works in the canon of Western art music, the 9 symphonies of Beethoven. In the next 9 videos, we'll focus on each symphony in turn, taking into account the compositional history and noting the interesting features of each work. In this introductory video, we'll look at the genre of the symphony and consider its significance in Beethoven's creative output. By the way, what you're hearing right now is an excerpt of the Berlin Philharmonic under Sir Simon Rattle playing Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, a work which, as we'll see, seems to have been very much on Beethoven's mind as he was working on his first symphony. But first of all, what is a symphony anyway? The word symphony is derived from the Greek word for consonants or sounding together. The term actually had many different meanings throughout its long history. By the start of the 18th century, however, the word sinfonia came to refer to the instrumental introduction to an Italian opera, equivalent to what the French called ouverture or overture. The sinfonia usually comprises 3 movements in the order fast, slow, fast. As an example, here is the sinfonia to the opera Griselda by Alessandro Scarlatti. The instrumentation is quite typical for a sinfonia: 2 trumpets and 2 oboes in addition to the strings. Sometimes the horns would be used instead of the trumpets. The fast, slow, fast organization is very clear. The sinfonia begins presto. It then features a contrasting adagio, and finally returns to presto again. From this modest beginning as overtures to Italian operas, symphonies began to take on a life of their own. They became independent orchestral compositions that were played at a variety of social occasions. For instance, symphonies would serve as entertainment music for the nobility as they enjoy their tea and engage in conversation and card playing. By the end of the 18th century, more than 16,000 symphonies had been written. Traditionally, vocal music, like the opera, enjoyed higher status than instrumental music, like the symphony. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote in his Critique of Judgment that instrumental music is more pleasure than culture. According to this view, instrumental music can move the passions, but without the aid of words, it cannot express any concrete concepts. When cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker characterizes music as auditory cheesecake in the 1990s, he seems to be echoing this view. But in the early 19th century, instrumental music in general, and the symphony in particular, was enjoying a rise in aesthetic status. The German romantics such as Wachenrode, Tieck, and E.T.A. Hoffmann promoted the idea of music as an autonomous world of expression, and the very defects of instrumental music that Kant complains about, that is, the lack of text and definite object, began to be seen as an asset. Unburdened by the limitations of semantics and syntax, the German romantics believed that instrumental music could provide access to a higher truth. Beethoven's symphonies can be understood in this context. Indeed, Beethoven played a pivotal role in the remarkable transformation of the symphony from entertainment music into a privileged medium for the most profound ideas. Beethoven himself is reported to have once remarked that music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. The 19th century symphony typically comprises 4 movements that exhibit the following pattern. The first movement is fast and cast in sonata form. Sometimes preceded by a slow introduction, this movement is traditionally the most substantial and complex movement of the symphony. The second movement is slow and lyrical in character. It usually presents a contrasting key and meter. The third movement would traditionally be a minuet and trio. The minuet is an elegant dance in triple meter. In his symphonies, however, Beethoven prefers to replace the minuet with the more energetic scherzo. The finale is fast, typically livelier and lighter in tone than the first movement. It can be in sonata, rondo, or sonata-rondo form. Looking at this 4-movement plan, the symphony appears very much like a sonata for orchestra, but there are actually significant differences between the symphony and the sonata. For one thing, the sonata was a domestic genre, whereas the symphony was intended to be heard in larger spaces. Because of this, composers had to use broader gestures and simpler themes in their symphonies so that the music would be clearly intelligible in these reverberant spaces. More importantly, however, the symphony features the widest possible range of instruments, and each instrument makes a valuable contribution to the whole. It's as if the diverse voices of an entire community are represented more or less equally. In this way, the symphony can be understood as symbolizing a democratic society, or more idealistically, our common humanity. Certainly, Beethoven's 9th Symphony would give voice to this ideal and make it resound for generations to come. Needless to say, writing a symphony takes much skill and hard work. Despite this, however, the symphonic venture was usually not lucrative for composers and music publishers. Therefore, a composer who chose to tackle the challenge of writing a symphony probably had nobler intentions in mind than making commercial gains. To summarize, then, the symphony was increasingly regarded as a prestigious genre because of the following key factors: the rise in the status of instrumental music in general, the considerable skill required in writing a symphony, the inclusive democratic nature of the symphony, and the presumably lofty ambitions behind writing a symphony, as substantial financial gains are not likely to be generated thereby. For Beethoven, the symphony was a lifelong preoccupation. That is, his 9 symphonies reflect an artistic vision that evolves over a lifetime. Although the first symphony remains close to tradition, by the time Beethoven completed the 2nd Symphony, a contemporary critic would already comment that Beethoven made this great field of instrumental music his own, and by the time Beethoven wrote the 3rd Symphony, his pupil, Ferdinand Ries, would prophesy that heaven and earth will tremble when it is performed. In terms of numbers alone, Beethoven wrote far fewer symphonies than Haydn and Mozart. Consider, for example, that Beethoven wrote his 1st symphony when he was almost 30 years old. In comparison, Mozart already wrote all but the last 3 of his symphonies at the same age. Beethoven's quantitatively meager symphonic output was partly due to the changing patronage situation. Unlike Haydn, Beethoven had no permanent appointment with an aristocratic household, and finding venues for large orchestral works was not easy. But more importantly, Beethoven seems to prize quality far above quantity. Though he wrote only 9 symphonies, there's a real sense that he worked hard to make each one of them a distinctive artistic creation. Because of this, I think it is completely justified to devote sustained attention to each of the Beethoven symphonies, as we'll do in the following 9 videos. So please stay tuned. Thanks for watching.